And without further ado, I'm going to bring to you that good leadership, our school board president here in the city of Detroit, LaMar Lemmons.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You know, I heard, listened to all the testimonies today, and some of them, the analogy between the Civil War, I think, is apropos. It's apropos in that after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, there was the aftershock, where, in essence, African Americans were re-enslaved through Jim Crow, and not just through segregation, but through a process of imprisonment, vagrancy laws, that if someone was unemployed, that they could be incarcerated and then employed through the incarceration. And now, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because let me give you a quick synopsis of what the Detroit Public Schools has gone through starting from 1999. In 1999, under John Engler, the state legislature, and I happen to be a member of that legislature, but and part of the vocal minority that fought against Public Act 10. And under Public Act 10, and let me say this, at the time of Public Act 10 first, that we had a $93 million budget surplus, a $40 million rainy day fund, and most importantly and most attractively to the powers that be, was a $1.5 billion bond authority. And so they came up with, they fabricated a law based on their desire to control that $1.5 billion bond and to dole out those contracts, because the board at that time clearly delineated that there would be African American contractors and pro-democratic contractors that would directly benefit in the construction of those schools. So to undermine that, they had to come up with a rationale to take over the school. Well, they couldn't use test scores because Detroit scored in the middle of the state. So if they used test scores, they would have had to take half as a rationale, they would have had to take half of the school districts in the state. Because particularly in the 90s, we still had a solid middle class. And let's be real, class is the greatest predictor of education outcomes. And so they couldn't use that. They couldn't use the budget because we had a $93 million surplus and a $40 million rainy day fund. So they couldn't use the budget. So they said, well, you have a high dropout rate. But with the dropout rate, there was no ability to track the students. In other words, they were counting students that graduated in the traditional systems in suburbs and even Detroit schools. In other words, because we had a large impoverished population, they tend to be a little in transit. So they would move from neighborhood to neighborhood. And if you started off at Finney and graduated from Cody, they counted you a dropout. A dropout because they didn't go. You started at a school, and they didn't. There was no tracking, and that was partly due to the districts not having a good tracking for them. But they didn't have it in Lansing either, so they couldn't identify. In addition to that, we used to grab, because of some of the struggles that some of the parents and families have that were attending Detroit Public Schools. Kids that would drop out, they would drop back in and go get their GED through an adult ed. So fast forward, after 7 years of state control, they returned it to elected governance with a $250 million deficit, $250 million deficit, and told the elected board to fix it. Well, Detroit did what Detroit does, and elected the highly erudite board. We had 3 lawyers, 2 medical doctors, etc., but they had no institutional memory. And believe me, you want your politicians to be politicians.
Yes, sir.
And so there was no cohesion and no institutional memory, no experience, and so the board didn't do the best job. I will concede to that. That board, with all the lawyers and all the medical doctors and stuff, they had no experience, and they picked Connie Calloway. That was one of the things that things they did. But I'm not going to. I digress. they returned it with a $250 million deficit, and when the board could not fix that deficit, they used Public Act 72, which was on the books for years, as a rationale to take over the district. What we didn't know, and again, I'm gonna name names and Democrats, our good friend Jennifer Granholm had extended a bond. It was from her heart, she extended a $200 million bond without telling anybody, because that was between her and then Burnley. By the way, let me say this. The initial person to take over the district, David Adamati, let me say this to his credit. Now, one part, the unions were not, like, he took the principals out of the union, so the first thing they did was to decertify the principals union. But to his credit, he did right-size the district and left a surplus, another $10–15 million surplus on top of, and most importantly, because when we were controlling when the board was controlling it, they scoffed and said, well, we probably didn't have $94 million surplus. But Adamati, their agent, certified that that surplus was indeed real, and he increased it before leaving. He said I only would take it for 1 year. Now, you have to know that Wayne State has been covetous of our school senate building for a long time. Right. And Adamati, being a man of integrity, although he spent money, fixed the building up, he would not, because it would appear to be a conflict, he would not pull the trigger. But they alleged that he greased the skids, because the first thing that Burnley did was sell a building that we already had that was actually generating profit, because we had tenants in the building, and it was completely paid for. So they sold that building under the takeover. This is part of how we got that $250 million deficit. And then they purchased 4 floors of the Fisher building, just 4 floors, when we had a building, a con building. Fisher building's a con building. The school center building was a con building. They bought 4 floors for more than they paid for the entire Fisher building the year before. And when you hear that story, they don't tell you that it was the state's CEO, the Robert Bob enters, and with this $250 million deficit, and I can say a lot of things, but I don't want to be all day, so I'll say that at the end of his 2-year tenure, well, first of all, he was the emergency financial manager. So he was only supposed to be dealing with finance, but he took over the district and said, I'm going to do it if somebody stops me, knowing that the wheels of justice grind ever so slowly. So in the interim, he's running everything. After 2 years, we prevail, and by that time, we have a Republican administration, and this is how Public Act 4 came in, the effect. This is what happened. And as a matter of fact, they tried to get us to sign a consent agreement, but I was on that board. There wasn't going to be no consent agreement. So I said, they told us, well, we'll just go to Lansing and we'll change the law. I said, but then let us all drink of the Kool-Aid. If it's good enough for Detroit, then it's good enough for the entire state. And that's why you have Public Act 4. That was the genesis. Robert Bob helped craft Public Act 4. Because when you look at all the cities, the biggest fish in all of this is the Detroit Public Schools. And then now later they're going on the city of Detroit. But prior to the city of Detroit, we have more students than any of those other cities have people. Not to mention the population, the budget, etc. Also, they're hiding some of the things that they've done. People should be going to jail. If they were elected officials, they would be in jail. They make Kwame look like a choir boy, some of the things that happen in this, and they keep us away from the books. And of course, they publish something online, but the devil is in the details. So after Robert Bob returns, after 2 years of Robert Bob, he increased the deficit by another $100 million. Enter Roy Roberts. Roy Roberts comes in, and this is real important, and it's going to be important for Herbert, and I'm saying this because Roy Roberts said this in public, that both Burnley and Robert Bob were crooks, and they ought to be in jail. And we haven't, so I said, oh, really? His attorney got him to stop it. It's too late. The cat was out the bag. Because we know we're going to, at some point, he will sit on in a court, and someone's going to ask him about those comments. So Roy Roberts, he gives this speech how he downsized, which he did. He downsized all the people all the contractors, because Robert Bob gave contracts all over the place. And because he wasn't from Detroit, all those contracts were going outside. At least you can say the contracts for Kwame, those are all people we knew. whatever the money was circulating in the community. But whether they be ill-guided or not, that's for the court to determine, right? Bobby Ferguson from the hood, am I right? Bobby Ferguson from the hood, right? We know Bobby Ferguson, right? Well, let's be real. Roy Roberts was sending people stuff out to Scotland, sending out to D.C., all over, the contractors. He closed our bus. He closed our bus system. He was giving out contractors all over the place because he viewed himself as a national, international player, which he was. Robert Bob was an international player. He didn't care anything about Detroit, so he doled out to all of his previous vendors and businesses that he already established. Conflicts up the wazoo. So whatever you say about Kwame, whatever you say, we know all those people that were getting they went to Southwestern, we know the hood. We can follow those. We know all those people, the Candias, we know them. I know them from right down the street on Seward since they were born. So, but Robert Bob took all our money and put it all over to the four winds. So it ain't even circulating in the community. Roy Roberts comes in and he follows the rest of the Republican agenda. Yes. Now remember this. The Republican agenda is to take public money and put it in private hands. To take public money, take your money, and the monies that they have not previously had access to were the Detroit dollars, right? And the black dollars. They didn't have direct access to those dollars until they came up with these new configuration schemes. And now they do. And so, for instance, they closed. We had a school called Guyton on the east side that was doing exceedingly well, beating the bejesus out of the charter schools in a way. What do? They closed it down so that the charters wouldn't have competition. So that the Heritage Foundation, whose board is in Grand Rapids, so you know how often a parent can go drive up to Grand Rapids from the hood on the east side, who has to catch the bus to go to the meeting downtown, and can't hardly make that meeting. But it's the only school in the neighborhood. So in parts of Detroit, the only schools in the neighborhood are the charter schools. That's by design. Yeah. And then to expedite it, they came up with the EAA, the Educational Achievement Authority. Now with the Educational Achievement Authority, they said these schools are failing. But they forgot to tell you that if you failed 3 consecutive years, you've had control of it for 4 consecutive years and 11 out of the last 13. Right. So if they're failing, you failed them. Right. And no school had to go in the EAA because all you do is reconstitute the school, change the principal, or change the name of the school. Which is why you saw us trying to quickly change the names of the schools and et cetera to get it to retain those schools. So they created the EAA, but the problem is they kept some of the same principles. So what are you changing? The downtown is the same. Roy Roberts is over the EAA and he's over the DPS. He's the contractor and the contractee. If that's not a conflict, I don't know what is. So that's a lot of information in a relatively short period of time.